Protesters have shut down college campuses across the country, creating a level of tension not seen since the Vietnam War. Ultimatums have been issued, threats of suspension and expulsion have been made, but students continue to rally in support of Palestinians. And now police across the country have started cracking down, arresting over 1,000 protesters. At Columbia University, where the protest started, the NYPD stormed Hamilton Hall using flashbangs and riot gear, arresting dozens who barricaded themselves inside. On the West Coast, violence broke out on UCLA's campus after counter-demonstrators decked out in black outfits tried to force their way through barricades put up by pro-Palestinian protesters. And in Austin, the University of Texas has seen its own demonstrations. Governor Greg Abbott quickly moved state troopers onto the campus and made waves of arrests, but students and protesters continue to stand their ground. As campus administrations struggle to handle the situation, students across the country are standing up and speaking out. Take a look.
Students have been protesting for years. My tuition allows me to get on this grass.
This is violent. What they did is violent. They came in here, they broke things, they smashed things, they assaulted students on their way in.
I've not felt anything except love and appreciation in this environment and people who are really, really curious to learn more.
We are forced to learn in an environment that is not conducive to one in which we feel welcomed or let alone safe in.
As a Jewish student, I didn't feel threatened. I've never felt more anti-Semitism in my life than I have this morning from the people holding Israeli flags.
We go on the lawns, or the protest leaders, they say, we have Zionists on our encampment. Push the Zionists out.
Anti-Zionism is not anti-Judaism. Being anti-Zionist is not anti-Semitic.
From the river to the sea calls for the annihilation of the Jewish people. That's not okay. That is not free speech.
We are calling for protection of civil liberties and freedom of speech on this campus, as well as divestment.
I'd like to see as an institution the ability to call out all hate speech because there's some pretty vulgar rhetoric being cast here.
Joining us now from Nexstar Nation's KXAN in Austin, Texas, is Capitol Bureau reporter Monica Madden. Monica, it's so great to see you, and thank you so much for being here with us. We saw these images coming in from Austin and really campuses across the country where you saw these clashes between protesters, counter-protesters, law enforcement. I mean, was that what was on the ground in Austin?
Yeah, Monday was by far the most chaotic day of protests so far at UT Austin. We had just a huge crowd of protesters, met with tons of police, whether it was state, local, or campus police. And at that point, we had 79 arrests on Monday alone. About, I believe it was around 40, maybe almost 50 of them were not even students. So we definitely saw more outside people coming to the campus to join these protests. There were flashbangs. Police were using pepper spray to try and disperse the crowd. They had set up tents and were linking arms, trying to almost resist getting arrested. And that created even more of this clash and back and forth between police and protesters. But obviously, police still grabbing some of those students. At some point, you would see them being pushed to the ground as they were resisting the arrest. So it was just a lot of this back and forth, very chaotic situation. But all of that really dissipated by yesterday, by Tuesday, Julia. Yesterday was the calmest we have seen it. Small group, about 100, maybe 150 demonstrators. They were just sitting around on that same South Lawn where you've seen all of those images coming from. They had a pizza party. They were reading scripts, if you will, or it was packets about the Israel-Palestine conflict. They had speakers, and it was really calm, minimal chanting, lower police presence, I think because we had a smaller group of demonstrators. So, one might speculate that a lot of the chaos that we saw on Monday, especially with all the arrests and how many law enforcement officers were there, might have discouraged that crowd from coming back and returning. Definitely, they were unable to set up tents in a permanent basis like we've been seeing over at Columbia, for example.
So, Monica, on Monday, we saw that wave of arrests in Austin, and then we've seen arrests, as close as, this morning or earlier on Thursday in New York, and then, of course, at UCLA. Do you think these protests, not only in Texas, but across the country, or I should say the arrests in Texas and across the country, are they really riling up the students?
I think it's a little bit of a mix, Julia. For some students, the arrests might have been a deterrent. We definitely saw, as I mentioned, the protest yesterday was really, really calm and didn't get out of control. There were no clashes between police and students. Maybe that's attributable to the sheer volume of arrests that we saw on Monday at UT. 79 were arrested. A lot of these students, they have their entire lives ahead of them. So, who knows if the charges will be dropped. They don't know that in the moment. So I can see that being a deterrent. But for others, we did see when police first came to the scene last Wednesday, the very first day of demonstrations at UT, it almost then emboldened students to, I would say it certainly made the situation more tense and escalated the situation when they were met with officers in riot gear. It attracted more bystanders. It kind of created, for some, this attitude of anti-police. And I think that is where we saw a little bit more of that active clash between some of the protesters and the law enforcement officers last Wednesday, continuing, of course, to protest on Monday. But it died down on Tuesday. So I think it's a different story for each individual.
You've been hearing these calls across the country from these pro-Palestinian student protesters for their respective universities to divest from companies that have ties to the Israeli government or the Israeli military. What are the student protesters at UT Austin in particular demanding, and are there any companies they're targeting?
They haven't named any companies in particular, Julia, but they are calling for UT to divest from weapons manufacturing companies. So that's one of their specific calls that they have really been focusing on. A lot of them say that they want the university to divest from Israeli companies, but there's not any evidence that that is a thing, if you will. They're also calling for the county to drop all charges. They want amnesty for all of the protesters who have been arrested. And lastly, these student protesters are really upset with how the university has handled this from the get-go, like I alluded to when they were met with police in riot gear before things even really got out of control last Wednesday. So they are calling for President Jay Hartzell of UT to resign as well.
Well, on that note, what's the latest from campus leadership? We saw their initial response, but as we get, more into these protests, what's leadership doing?
Yesterday, I was trying to figure out what the game plan was in case things did get out of hand, which they did not yesterday. But university leaders said they wouldn't comment specifically on their police tactics and protocol for how university police are handling things. That said, university leaders have said they are in constant communication with the Texas Department of Public Safety, which is your state troopers, for example. And the university and the Department of Public Safety has said that they are on standby, if you will, ready to assist as needed if the university calls upon state troopers to get on scene and respond to any of these potential more protests that might pop up, Julia.
You mentioned UT Texas President Jay Hartzell, but we know that him and Governor Greg Abbott have both faced backlash for quickly cracking down on the student protests. How have faculty and students looking on at these protests and the response to the protests, how have they reacted?
Again, it depends on who you speak to. I have, each day that I've been there, have made the point to make sure that I'm talking both to the pro-Palestinian protesters, but also the counter-protesters who are in support of Israel, a lot of them being Jewish. And the Jewish students have been really grateful for the university's response and how they've handled it. They think that because the university was proactive and not reactive with law enforcement on campus, that it actually made students safer and prevented it from becoming one of these out-of-control situations like we're seeing at UCLA and Columbia, for example. So the Jewish students at UT, some of them, not all of them, are happy with how the university and how Governor Abbott has handled this and vocally supported Israel. On the other hand, though, a lot of the pro-Palestinian protesters, students, and I verified a lot of their student status when I was talking to them, they are really upset with how this has been handled. They thought that it was premature to send DPS state troopers in riot gear last week before anything even was out of control. They all said their plans were to have a peaceful protest and exercise their First Amendment rights. So they feel it was hypocritical of leadership in the university to go ahead and send that force of police before things got out of control, especially because Texas is a state that has, been proud of its support of students and their rights to protest. 4 years ago, Governor Greg Abbott passed a law protecting free speech on Texas state college campuses. So some of these protesters feel it's hypocritical, and they feel it is because of what they are protesting. So again, mixed bag depending on who we speak to on campus.
So how wide have these protests spread on Texas campuses? And are you surprised at really how reaching these student protests have become in the U.S. and, ultimately across the world?
As far as in Texas, UT Austin has been the largest one. We've seen some smaller protests, not though this consistent daily demonstrations like what we've been seeing at UT. We saw some at the University of Texas in Dallas. We saw some at Texas State, A&M. So smaller scale protests did not have the same level of police response as well. And to the second part of your question, I can't say I am surprised. I mean, historically speaking, universities have been the bedrock for these type of protests, especially when it comes to war, like we saw in the 70s, for example, when the Vietnam War was going on. So I think it's a long-standing tradition for students. They're encouraged on these college campuses to, think freely and think about these global events that are going on and express their opinions on it publicly if they feel so. And of course, always encouraged to do so in a lawful way. So I do think it's pretty par for the course that we're seeing these demonstrations, but I think to the scale of where they're going in terms of at least looking at the images from Columbia, seeing them shattering the building and everything like that, breaking in, taking control, that part does surprise me that it has gotten out of control to that extent.
Yeah, a lot of comparisons being drawn between, today and those Vietnam War protests. Monica Madden, thank you so much for your insight from Texas with our partners at KXAN. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Julia.
Most universities have said they support freedom of speech and will allow campus protests, but they say the encampments violate school policy. This past week, dozens more were arrested at college campuses, cracking down on those encampments, including Columbia University and Northeastern, where close to 100 people were detained. Joining us now is constitutional law expert and criminal defense and civil rights lawyer, Robert McWhirter. Robert, thank you so much for joining us. How much protection do these students protesting have under the First Amendment?
Well, those who are in public universities have the same First Amendment protections as anybody else in any other situation. That's because the public universities are an arm of government, and therefore the Constitution directly applies to them. Now, they can still be restricted in their speech by time, place, and manner, and they can't do things that kind of impinge upon the main purpose of the university. But they have pretty broad free speech rights as long as it's speech. Now, that maybe does not include camping out on the university green, but they have that. Now, the students in private universities, on the other hand, do not have as broad a protection of speech. They do if they walk off campus. But when they're on campus, private universities are just private companies, and they have the right to define a little bit more restrictions on their grounds than, for instance, public universities do.
So, Robert, what rights do students ultimately have to protest? I know that there's the difference between the public and private campus, but, what exactly can they do?
Well, look, in America, you can say whatever you want, but you're not always protected from the consequences of what you say. Government cannot infringe on your rights of free speech, and it cannot give you a prior restraint on what you want to say. That's why there's the distinction between public universities and private universities. Now, these students are free to voice their opinions. That does not necessarily mean that they are free to just camp out on university property and affect the educational mission of the campus. In other words, if they're blocking entrances to classrooms or buildings, the First Amendment won't necessarily protect that. But it certainly will protect them being able to stand and speak and say what their mind is in their position. It just doesn't necessarily protect a camping ground, because that's more action, that's not speech.
Yeah, and I want to get to that. I mean, how it's impacting people outside of these protesters. But one other aspect of this is the fact that both sides have accused each other of hate speech. How is hate speech defined, and really how difficult is it to prove that hate speech has taken place? Because we're hearing it from both sides. And, I guess we're not necessarily seeing firsthand every single incident that's being reported.
Yeah, and you get a lot of people saying this was said about me. Look, there is no clear single definition of hate speech. And different countries define hate speech in different ways. For instance, in West Germany, it's considered hate speech to deny that the Holocaust occurred. Well, here we have much broader range of speech. And the Supreme Court, as late as 2011, in Snyder versus Phillips, for instance, said that, hey, you have great freedom to say things. There really is no such thing as hate speech, because that's just speech, and speech is protected by the Constitution. That given case was, if you remember, the Hillsborough Baptist Church were outside kind of making a demonstration in the funeral of that young man, Shepherd, who had been killed because he was gay. And they were saying horrible things about God hates homosexuals and things like that at his funeral. Well, that is something that the government cannot prevent.
Yeah.
That's protected speech. As ugly as it was, it's protected. Now, that doesn't mean that they can go on somebody's private property and do that, or at a private university. It also doesn't mean that they're protected from the consequences. So, for instance, let's say you go to a rally where you're espousing neo-Nazism and you decide to come back to work on Monday and your employer fires you. Well, your employer has every right to do so. You don't have a First Amendment right to do that. Now, if your employer is the federal government or a state government, well, then maybe they're restricted because there the government is impinging the right to free speech. But an individual doesn't necessarily have to follow that. I can fire my employees for whatever reason, as long as they don't have in their contract that I have the right to go attend neo-Nazi rallies or something like that. Then the employer has every right to fire that employee, and the First Amendment has nothing to say about it. What I always say in other terms, you have a broad First Amendment right, you have freedom to speak your mind, but that doesn't protect you from everybody thinking you're a jerk because of what you say.
I've seen so many comparisons of 2024 to 1968 for a number of reasons. But most recently, we've heard a lot about the parallels between today's Gaza protests and the Vietnam War protests on college campuses in the 60s. Do you see that parallel? And do you think those campus protests in the late 60s set any sort of precedent for what we're seeing now?
Oh, sure. I think the folks today are taking a playbook. I would have some question, or a page from the playbook. I would have some question. A large percentage of the people who are being arrested on campuses now are actually not students. And I think in the 1960s, they predominantly were actually students at those universities. And in a sense, they had a little bit more pertinent issue because a lot of those students were looking at being drafted and sent to Vietnam, which of course is not the situation here. Look, I think it's important to recognize that these students or these people have a valid message. They want to get their message heard, but they don't have the right to then close down a campus and stop the educational mission of even a state university. So certainly there are parallels to this, and I'm sure they've taken a page out of the playbook, but there are some distinct differences as well.
I would imagine that, there's obviously these accusations that are happening from both sides, and I would imagine that there will be future litigation on this. Do you foresee future legal battles involving these universities, these students, these protesters, maybe even law enforcement outside of the university? Do you foresee any of these legal battles playing out long term?
Oh, certainly there can be. So for instance, let's say somebody is saying a bunch of anti-Semitic things, and that causes somebody to get beaten up for being Jewish. Well, that person has a lawsuit against the person that beat them up, and maybe against the university that allowed that to occur without any controls. Conversely, if somebody says something anti-Palestinian and the person gets hurt or something along that line, there is a potential lawsuit right there. If the police engage and close these down in a way that is excessive use of force, well, there's a potential lawsuit against the police and the universities there, against the states and the private universities as well, in terms of the way they conduct this. I think they're being very careful not to, but there could always be potential lawsuits. There will be a lawsuit to test the boundaries of free speech. And a lot of these protesters, be they students or not, are going to try to go to the federal courts and say, look, what I was doing was allowed under the First Amendment, and the Supreme Court will have an opportunity to redefine the boundaries of free speech again in a different context. This stuff happens perennial, and that's a good thing for democracy. We want these questions always being asked, and we want the right to free speech affirmed with its definitions and its limitations.
So you see this going as far up as the Supreme Court?
Well, sure, if the Supreme Court will take it. It'll certainly go through the federal courts, the local district court, and then the circuit courts of appeals. People are going to want to use this as a test case.
Right.
Now, one of the things I always say is, I'm pretty much a free speech absolutist, but my right of free speech doesn't give me the right to go at 3 o'clock in the morning outside of your house with a bullhorn, even if I'm standing on a public street, and start yelling at the top of my voice some political issue. I don't have that right. I get arrested for being a public nuisance. That's not going to the content of my speech. That's going to my behavior of being outside of your house or apartment at 3 in the morning, yelling something in a bullhorn, which wakes the entire neighborhood up. Okay, that is not protected conduct. Now, what I say may be protected speech. I'm just not allowed to give it at 3 o'clock in the morning in front of your house. So that's kind of one of the distinctions to keep in mind here.
Right. And I want to touch on a point you made earlier. Since the protests have started, many Jewish students have left campus, while some schools have canceled classes. We know that the House is set to vote on a bill that would redefine anti-Semitism. Could this give universities more power to crack down on protesters, specifically when it comes to protesting involving Israel?
Well, sure it could. But see, this is where you're going to get the court case. Sure, Congress can pass a bill that says you're not supposed to say something, but that's exactly why you go to the federal courts to see if that'll pass the First Amendment. You have the right in America to say terrible things. You have the right to be a racist, bigoted, sexist, anti-Semitic, anti-Palestinian, neo-crazy, communist, fascist, if you wish to. You can say all those things. So to pass a bill to say that you can't say certain things is really kind of anathema to the Constitution itself. And if you follow the precedent that the Supreme Court has set, the federal courts will say that those statutes are unconstitutional. You can define anti-Semitism as almost anything you want, and I think anti-Semitism is horrible, and it's got a horrible history in Western civilization and what that has led to. And of course, we all know about that. But that doesn't mean you give government the power to start restricting speech. At least that's the theory of our Constitution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the great Supreme Court justice, talked about the marketplace of ideas. And at least the theory of our Constitution is that in a free and open debate, the best ideas will eventually come forward. That's a challenged idea with the age of the internet, Facebook and Twitters and Truth Social and all this stuff. But at least that's the theory of our Constitution for now. And that's what we have to hope in.
Well, Robert McWhirter, thank you so much for your expertise on this. I mean, there seems to be no end in sight here. We're really in uncharted territory, so we appreciate you helping us break it down.
My great pleasure.